So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Catalyze webinar, Medical Devices, Crossing the Abyss from Development to Design Lock. My name is Patrick Ahern with RTI, and I'll be helping out with the virtual room today. So just a quick note, when you log in, your microphone will be automatically muted with web cameras turned off. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Catalyze website in the days following the webinar. During today's session, if you have any questions for a presenter, you may submit those into the Q&A window at any time. Closed captions are available during today's webinar, and you may turn those on by clicking the Show Captions button on your main Zoom toolbar. If you run into any technical issues, please let me know in the Q&A window as well. And we will open a webinar evaluation poll in the last few minutes of the webinar, and the Catalyze team would greatly appreciate your feedback. So at this time, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to Garrison to introduce today's session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. Hello, everyone. My name is Garrison Spencer, and I lead the skills development component of the Catalyze program. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Catalyze webinar on crossing the abyss from development to design lock for medical devices. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Diane Earp, who brings over 20 years of experience in regulatory affairs and quality assurance. And she's going to be sharing insights drawn from her work across the US and international regulatory environments, supporting drug, biologic, and medical device development, testing and validation, manufacturing, and commercialization. So with that, I will turn it over to Diane to get us started.
Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. I'm absolutely thrilled that you have made yourself available to talk with me on a Friday afternoon in the middle of the summer when I'm sure everyone has better things to do. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to have a discussion today about what I consider crossing the abyss from development to design lock in medical devices, one of the most critical times during which your product goes from being a feasibility, conceptual idea to actually becoming a product. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today is to provide kind of a basic understanding of the process for in vitro diagnostics and therapeutic medical devices to get to design lock and ultimately how to become a marketable product status, if you will. We're not going to get into FDA submission processes. That's the next phase, obviously, and that's the ultimate goal is to get that product cleared or approved so that it is marketable. But this is more around the mechanisms to get there, if you will. So we're going to talk about with objectives, understanding what the design lock milestone really means, how design controls make that possible, and when it's appropriate to actually lock your product. Sometimes hear things like we have a near lock version, and it's kind of almost locked, or we're going to lock it, but they're moving forward anyway. So we're going to talk about what the implications are for that today. We're going to also identify some common design pitfalls, things that can cause you to get into a vicious cycle where that abyss is getting closer and closer to the thing you're going to fall into, and their impact on downstream processes and critical market timelines and how to avoid those as well. Then we're going to discuss some success factors on a more positive note, ways to make sure you don't have to take a look into that deep abyss, but rather cross over and keep going to a positive outcome, and talk about, if time permits, a couple of scenarios where they really did happen and kind of what probably led to that. I'm not going to do a long and deep postmortem, but give you something to think about. Next slide. So when we come to talking about medical device development, what the idea is to turn an idea or a concept or something that you have found is either potentially meaningful in the research lab or is already showing you promising in the research environment, promising capabilities to claim impactful support in a medical healthcare environment for patients. So when you think about it, your design process in reality, even if you are in a research use only environment, is that you're taking your idea, you're building a prototype, you're going to design it, test it, evaluate it, get into this cycle so that you can build a prototype, ultimately prove that it works, and then attempt to sell it. The actual idealization to market process, though, requires more. Next slide, please. When you look at all of the complex iterative design process and all of the things that go into that design, define, design, test, and evaluate process that I know all of you are familiar with, you really start to see things that are pushing and pulling at your progress. It's a complex iterative design process, and it can become a repetitive pitfall. When you start seeing things putting pressure, you try to address that specific issue. But sometimes we fail to see that the pressure on one side impacts the other side and things start to unravel. So it's really important to avoid that repetitive cycle of events that kind of you seem to create problems when you're solving problems so that you can avoid the abyss of ever-changing specifications. And that's the thing that we're really focusing on here is ever-changing specifications. Next slide, please. I know all of you are familiar with the general approach to get a product to market, the conceptual exploration and feasibility studies, the design engineering. These are your R61 to R33 efforts, and then ultimately preclinical in some cases where you're in there gathering the appropriate amount of data to defend and support the claims that you're making your device can do. When you look at that from the perspective of where do I lock this thing? When do I stop testing and validating and verifying that it's working and say, this is it. This is the product. This is the first generation that we're going to
I, I think Diane might be frozen. Are you still with us, Diane? So I think maybe let's message her and see if she can call in case her internet is not working. Oh, good. I'm really happy that I spoke to Mara earlier.
Yes, she did say that the call-in option was her backup, so hopefully she has that up, but I just sent it to her too. Sorry, everyone, hang in there with us.
Great. Thank you for doing that, Marissa. And yes, please hold. Apologies for the delay.
The tech on a Friday afternoon, I guess, is yes, Joseph just submitted a question in the chat. This webinar is being recorded and will be available after the fact. We'll go ahead and send the recording out to everyone who registered for the webinar, and it will be posted publicly on our Catalyze website as well, on the events page. Okay, everyone, let me try and call Diane. Give me 1 second. Sorry.
Hi, folks. This is Diane.
Great, Diane. We can hear you. Glad to have you back.
I am so sorry. This is one of those things where it just cuts me off. I apologize to you all. I've got the slides open, but I can't see what you guys are seeing. So tell me which slides you're on, and we'll get started again real quick.
Yeah, we are on the general approach concept to marketable product slide.
Okay. So I think we talked about that a little bit. Let's go to the next slide.
All right,
Assuming
it's
you have them.
advanced, so go ahead.
Okay, so folks, I apologize for this. My computer sometimes gets caught up in security clearances. So hope you had a nice little break and got your coffee cups filled up. We're now looking at, so what happens when design lock is to have occurred before it gets ready for that design validation completion, and what happens, where are the usual risks of continuous redesign that drives failure to get past the design lock phase. And that is usually somewhere between pilot production, design verification, and design validation, where you have situations that it's not giving you the data that you thought you were going to get, or somebody comes up with an idea that says, you know what, while we were thinking about this and while you were doing this testing, what if? And then you start going, yeah, that would make things a lot easier. Let's modify that. Let's do some changes. And it keeps going until you're in this cycle of verification of test articles and materials, and then redesign flaws that come out of the changes that you've made cause you to have to go back into input. You come back out again and you're trying to get the test results. And now you're trying to differentiate. Can we use the values that we had when we tested this first version along with this next version where we've made some slight changes? And then we start justifying things like saying, well, it was just a minor change. And that's where things can go sideways really quickly, because justifying that without making sure that there's been no impact on other aspects of your device can manifest itself into bigger problems later on. Next slide, please. Garrison, if you'll let me know when you've got the slide up.
Oh, yep, it's advanced.
Okay. What are design controls? So in general terms, a set of quality practices and procedures that control the design. It's made up of the user needs, the intended uses, the unmet need you're trying to define and utilize your device to correct, how you want it to be used, and the design input requirements, where you're getting into this is what we need to make this thing work. Design controls ensure that the device is safe and effective. Those are the two buzzwords and the key elements, safe and effective. And all of that rolls into the risk assessment that you do from the start of the product design all the way through. That's a living document that if you are controlling your design efficiently, you're looking frequently at the risks that are upcoming or have been overcome to see what the impact has been on the design input requirements, meeting the user needs, and defining the intended use. It applies to all Class 2, 3 medical devices, as well as some Class 1 devices and in vitro diagnostics. So, and it also includes those automated with computer software. Computer software becomes a really interesting thing because the agency has some discretion. When I say agency, I mean the FDA has some discretion in how they apply the requirements there. And as Tom and I were talking about briefly before the meeting, depending on who your reviewer is at the FDA and depending on what division of the FDA you're going to be working with when you, or EMA or any other international organization, who you're working with depends on where the emphasis is placed. And that's important to engage with them early on and have conversations as you advance through your process, keeping in mind they're looking at safety, effectiveness, does it do what you said it's going to do, and what is the risk profile on this product? What's the potential for its failure? Or the potential, if it fails, what will be the potential impact on patients? Design classification, scope of the design controls is driven by, as I said before, the risk analysis and existing defined product codes, or in some cases, when there is no product code, the de novo requirements that are coming. Next slide. So why are design controls important? Well, I'm not going to burden you with this because this is kind of where my world is. But I wanted you to see it's only been about 30, 40 years that all of this has been an issue for folks. And it all started because medical device industry learned what happens without design controls. Very bad things can happen. And so it became evident that these machines, if you will, need to be monitored and maintained with respect to the focus on their risk profile and the effectiveness they're having. Just kind of as a general overview, you can see that it all started in the 1990s with the Safe Medical Devices Act. If anybody's really interested, I can dive more into this because this is my world. But it started to advance. As you can see, about every 4 or 5 years, something else would happen. But it wasn't until February of this year that something really happened that was quite surprising, but yet very much needed. And that is when the QSR started to align with the international regulations. For a long time, the international rules were basically the ISO requirements, but then with a few twists to it. The United States had its own set of issues or medical devices, the 820s in Title 21 of the CFR. But all of a sudden, over the last 20 years, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, 20 years, we started to see them coming together, in particular when products became marketed and sold more internationally. The CE marking came into play and a number of other idealistic things that started us thinking more around the human factors, usability, and risk management. Next slide. So why are design controls important worldwide? You can see that there is a uniformity here. If there's one thing I would tell you about this is that they now have, although they all have different requirements, designated design controls are not always explicitly defined. Sometimes they're embedded within. And one of the biggest ways that it's been embedded is through the MDSAP participation of the ISO 13485 requirements for medical device. That's the one uniformity that seems to be threaded throughout all of the nations. So if you focused on that, it's also part of the U.S., and that's where the alignment has actually presented itself thus far. And I think there'll be even more coming, quite honestly. Next slide. So examples of the various types of medical device design controls, as I said earlier, they vary depending on who you're dealing with and what your product is as well. For combination products like drug-eluting stents, design controls have to be built into the system for both device and the components that they're interacting with. You're required to have a device-focused and a drug-focused quality system when you're dealing with, say, for example, a drug-eluting stent. With mechanical devices, a little bit different. Material measurements, mechanical performance, you get more of an inspection and test-based performance control there. And the way, one of the recommendations for a mechanical device, since there's not a lot of testing you can do, is to do stimulated studies in which the surgeons or the intended users are actually functionally using your product to see how it works. Next slide. Software as a medical device, that's another one that is, as I said before, is a little bit tricky because there's some discretion there in how the agency defines and monitors and ensures compliance with respect to medical device. Diagnostic algorithms is an example. Design inputs include how the algorithm performs, cybersecurity, data handling specifications. Change control becomes very critical with a diagnostic algorithm. There's where the risk occurs most frequently is in potential failure. Clinical performance studies and real-world data really help out in this regard for the software. And in vitro diagnostics, at a diagnostic test kit, those are one of my favorite things to work on. Design controls, you're really looking at the clinical performance. Sensitivity, specificity is a balancing act. You get one up, the other goes down. You've got to balance there. And accuracy and precision, linearity, all of those are the really clinical performance that you need to prove in the actual samples that will be used for the test kit's design. Under the EU, the IVDR is a very specific performance event. It also requires reagent lot-to-lot consistency, which is kind of a unique thing there. Electrochemical devices such as imaging systems. Now we're getting into design controls for both hardware and software components. there's a plethora of electrical safety, the EMC, human factors, connectivity, cybersecurity. It all starts to become much more complex, and it's much more extensive and complex across those fields of utility. So you can see that design control is a topic, but depending on what your medical device is and how it performs, it can be very, very different from product to product. Next slide, please. So what is a design lock? Like I said, I've heard some folks say we're near lock. We have design locked, but it's a version 2 instead of version 3. It varies from its defined notation in many circumstances. It's really going back to that circular thing I was talking to you about earlier, where we want to call it locked, but we're still making some changes. And that's where you get into trouble, one of the places. It's a critical gate. When you say it's locked, it's the critical gate in the design and development process. This is where you've gone from a really nifty idea and something that you've made in the lab to now a commercializing product. I don't know if that's a word or not, Marissa, but commercializable product, I guess I should say. A formal milestone requiring approval of final design is one of the biggest documented elements that you need to have in your design control process. You're showing in that formal documentation that the design met all the requirements, specifications are clearly defined, and you're prepared to move into manufacturing, supply chain reproducible product, and regulatory submission. So it is a very critical decision-making point. Design has to satisfy safety, performance, and quality. Those are the essential elements to move forward with a validated and approved device. Next slide, please. So when should design lock happen? A really important question. Typically, it occurs after design validation is complete and before or during transfer of that design into manufacturing. So that's where people get a little fuzzy on, am I really ready to, am I done with the testing? Am I really ready to transfer it? Or maybe I want to transfer it and see if it'll work. Or maybe we're almost there, but what we have left to do isn't really that critical. Those kinds of waffling can really cause you serious problems. You really have to bite the bullet and decide the design validation is complete, and now we're ready to go. It requires a comprehensive review and sign off by, or should require, it does require, but you should make sure that you have sign off by your design team, your engineering, your quality, your regulatory leads, and all of your internal and external stakeholders. That's your management team. You really have to come to a point where everyone is aligned with what this product looks like and that we are moving forward to produce it. That one can sometimes fold into your business plan. You may go back and see that the designed idea somehow got off track, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's the important thing here, is to make sure you have a formalized process that engages all of these key individuals or groups of individuals to say, yep, this meets where my focus was, you've done it, this is right, we're ready to go. We have no further need to do more. After design lock, this is where it gets really critical that changes remain controlled. If you lock a product and you decide you're ready to move forward, but then you decide to start making changes, that's okay, as long as they're controlled and assessed for the risk impact, and that you have the required formal documentation of the prior approval for implementation. So when you reach a point where it's locked, it is the product, but we're going to make a change. Now it becomes a defined and controlled process to move forward. And I think that's where people get confused. If they are really trying to meet a deadline, they'll design lock knowing already that they have some changes that they're going to make. And so those get filtered in, and now you start getting confusion. So it's that clean change of, we've design locked it, it's here, here's how that change is going to affect, and we have looked at it from a risk impact to make sure we know what we're making the change do. And then looking at your data and what the impact of your submission process is going to be, that even though it was in design lock, we've made a change. So moving to the next slide, please. Steps taken in a typical design lock process. Again, I think this is just here as a reminder. Most folks already know this. You have the concept in phase one, idealization, design development, design verification and validation. You do the design review and approval. You freeze the design or lock it. That's another term that's frequently used with design lock. It's design freeze. And then afterwards, you transition to manufacturing, moving it into reproducible tooling and productization. And then changes are now very, very controlled. So the design transfer occurs with those key elements in the middle being completed. Now, when you move to reproducibility, that's where things can get really dicey sometimes, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Key activities that notoriously impact or delay your design block. Transfer to CMO or in-house manufacturing. Sometimes we have a timeline that is so strictly limited to, we have to have this moved to these folks who have already been brought in. We were on contract. They're ready to get started. Let us just have, you probably have heard this, let us just have the specifications that you have right now, and we'll get started while you finish up. That's where things start getting out of control. Not completing the design for manufacturing before implementing this in-house transfer, or failure to engage the GMP requirements at the appropriate time is one of the key notorious delays of design lock. Suppliers and materials, not having finalized your bill of materials or having selected who's going to be your ongoing supplier. Those haven't been confirmed. Or if you have no backup suppliers, that's also a weak link in your productization that can really slam you into a wall. If your supplier gets into trouble, or they go out of business and you don't have a defined backup supplier for a key element of your product, you can actually put yourself into a really serious situation. Sterility and stability, those are also things that we sometimes forget about. Failure to perform sterilization validation, failure to initiate stability studies designed to stimulate real time. Those get started late or not at all, and you've got a gap. And again, another serious delay in your product. And in fact, people have found that in doing their stability studies, things start to degrade. And what you thought was a stable device for its performance, or maybe in an IVD, the reagents, now you've got a problem that you may have to go all the way back to the design to figure out what to do about. So in particular for in vitro diagnostics, where you've got reagents and controls, getting that stability study done to know how long that test kit can sit on the shelf or be maintained is very, very critical from the onset. So you really have to start planning that in and getting those done. If you haven't, you're delayed. Next slide. Legal issues. These are things that can be very frustrating, in particular when it comes to IP protection and anti-tampering measures, cybersecurity, those kinds of things that if you don't control them and you don't get your legal issues dealt with, you can't go much further. You can't make a submission to the agency if you don't have intellectual property rights to do so with this product. So if your technology is being transferred from research labs into a small business or into a big company, or you're getting ready to sell your product, but you haven't cleared up all those issues, you're delayed. That, again, will stop you from going much further. And the sooner you get those things dealt with, the sooner you are able to maneuver and move forward. Once you get your product to design lock, if you don't own the property, the person that does can step up and take control. Lack of and I'm not a lawyer, so that's just something I see happen. You would have to understand the logistics by talking with your legal counsel. And I would suggest that anyone that's working on a medical device has a good lawyer with respect to the intellectual property issues. Lack of documentation. Not all design decisions can be found in the design and development history file. That's something that becomes a prolonged problem over time. If you didn't document all of the design decisions, if you didn't have a good design control process in place, when something starts to perform unexpectedly, very difficult to go back and see when that might have come into play or what might have caused it. So the design decisions, how you form the design and development history file is very, very important. No quality management, including when to produce under GLP versus GMP versus lab prototyping. using the lab, the prototype you developed in the lab to get feasibility testing, to really see how it's going to initially perform, to test out some aspects of it early on, that's great. But you got to know when you need to start getting data that's been obtained under GLP in your preclinical and when to go to GMP for your manufacturing. If you haven't done that, then much of your data can be deemed unacceptable for the submission process. So that's another critical, the lack of documentation there can delay. No change management plan in place, clearly reflecting independent approvals. That includes your management. And management needs to be an independent oversight of the development team. So you can't decide that your engineers who built your device is also the person that's going to approve it because that person has a manager title. You need to have that independency between the groups that are looking at the business, the anticipated market that it's going to be entered into, and looking at the quality of the documentation, what has happened, how the results fit together. All of those folks we talked about earlier have to come into play to make sure that change management is managing effectively, and that can impact your overall design lock if it's not there. Next slide, please. So now let's look at that abyss and talk about the design pitfalls to avoid. Critical misalignment, as I was just kind of alluding to, between your R&D, your quality and regulatory teams, your engineering team, starts producing something that isn't what the clinical unmet need was defined to be. The engineers get turned loose. They are brilliant people. They come up with something. They think they know how to make it better, and then they have actually missed the mark. So an alignment there is very critical for all of those individuals. And if you're early in, your R&D team likely has an engineering team, but may not have the other elements. And that's where it's important to start involving those people with those key expertise to kind of look at this in general, including executive leadership of someone who may have had a business. You may have a contract with an executive who has started up these kinds of businesses or built these kinds of products that you're working on to kind of help you see it from a different perspective. Delaying key activities. Cybersecurity sometimes gets overlooked until the end, and now you have a problem because what you've built can't be secured appropriately. Or required testing hasn't been done. Getting engaged with the agency. What are you going to require that we look at? Here's what we think we need to do. Do you concur? Is there something else you're going to expect? Waiting until you're ready to make the submission and having the agency come back, FDA come back to you and say, we would like to see all this other data or another complete activity done, can cost you literally millions of dollars. Engagement with regulatory agencies early on is really important. I can't stress that enough. That's why they have Q-submission conversations around medical devices. You can set up a time with the agency to let them know what you're working on, how it's going to, what you intend it to do, how it's performing, and asking them questions. They love to engage. Much like CDRH is a little bit unique in that respect, but they really like to get involved with medical devices. And I think it's primarily because those device development processes can move very, very quickly, as opposed to the drug process, which can go on for a number of years. Premature advancement, as we talked about a little bit earlier, failure to capture information key to the design information, or introducing enhancements in late-stage design. You know, I tell folks sometimes, you've got this wonderful idea, you start working on it, it meets what you expected and exceeds your expectations. Now you start thinking, you get off track a little bit and start thinking about, what if we let it do this? Or it's showing us that, so how about we change and do this as well? And you can get into this ever-changing environment by simply getting so excited about what your product can do that you're not ready to let it go forward. Failure to consider change opportunities is a balancing act, though. Sometimes that change can move you faster. Sometimes going from a very specific, targeted, intended use or claim to a more general screening kind of process. I always use the IVD, diagnostic test system, as an example. If you say this will always detect a certain type of disease state, you've got to prove that. But if you say your confirmatory test, if you say that this is a screening test for potential infectivity and requires a confirmation test in some other form or a follow-up with a physician, now you're a screening test. The same test kit, it's just what you're claiming it's going to do. and that changes sometimes how fast you can get into the marketplace. You can always later, post admission to the marketplace, monitor and gather data that shows a better specificity or enhanced performance and come back to the agency, but then you're on the market already. So failure to consider change opportunities can be a pitfall. It can hurt you, or failure to do what you need to do. Next slide. So key early stage questions. If you keep these questions in mind from the start of your product design, when you're in the feasibility stage, all the way through to design lock, you will likely not have these problems. Is there a significant unmet need for what I'm making? In other words, you have an idea, you've done your research, it looks like a great idea. Nobody's out there doing it, or the people that are doing it aren't doing it as efficiently as you believe you could. There's a patient population that needs to be served. You've defined what that is. Changing your population from adults to pediatrics or infants can significantly impact your risk profile. Even though it's the same product, now you're looking at a more vulnerable population, and therefore the risk changes. Environmental utility in clinical settings. You'll see when I talk with many of you, I've asked, what do you intend to say this is going to be used for? What are your claims? That may or may not be what you fully understand in the beginning, but that's what you're driving to. You want to know where it's going to be used in the hospital. I've heard the FDA ask this question. Where do you intend to use this? In the hospital, in a clinic, at home? Is the patient going to control this? Is a medical professional going to be there? What's the environment? That's, again, going back to the risk profile. Unmet, underutilized, marketable business needs. That's the thing you have to think about when you put your business plan up against your product. Great and wonderful ideas have been created in the laboratories and with scientific minds. Much of you are on the call that have done that. But if there's not a business for that product, the best thing that happens is you make some wonderful publications, and ultimately somebody else figures out how to use it. So really working together, your business strategy along with your product's capabilities builds you that marketable product design that then there's someone who's willing to pay for it. Can I produce a cost-effective solution? That's the other thing. Sometimes you have a great idea, a wonderful device, a fantastic test, but it takes so long and it's so expensive, no one could afford it. And then you get into that reimbursement, which is a whole nother discussion that we could get into, of reimbursement and how that fits together with your regulatory approval, which I urge all of you to consider as you start developing your products and taking them to approval or clearance. Those are the things that can determine whether or not you're actually going to get these things in front of patients. Scalability, how much money will it realistically take to create that prototype and confirm feasibility, and then transfer it to GMP manufacturing. Sometimes you can get it to confirmed prototype, great feasibility, attend meetings, make publications, do all kinds of marketing, but transitioning it to GMP manufacturing becomes so costly that now you're looking for venture capital in order to be able to get it there. And do you have enough of a story to tell that confirms that their investment will actually be worth it? Transitioning to GMP manufacturing from a prototype is one of the key risks, because now you've gone from the research world to a very controlled environment where everything has to be done repetitively, everything has to be within specifications, everything has to be checked and quality controlled, and it usually requires it does require a very unique environment, but usually is an environment that you may not have even thought about when you were in the research environment. Is a device reproducible on a large enough scale to meet patient need in business? We just talked about that. So those are questions that if you ask yourself, let's go to the next slide, please. You've kind of gotten yourself to a good point. Here are the rest of the questions. Product outcome. Is this for R&D? And I ask this question a lot when I'm talking about regulatory strategy. Are you planning on doing this just for publication, for seminars, for professional meetings and poster sessions? Or are you really developing a product that you want to either sell your technology or start a business? Those are very different outcomes. They're all good ones, but the effort that you have to put in along the way getting through design lock and into a manufacturable product depends on what the answer to those questions are. Engaging venture capitalists, translational science grants, or other types of investors, if that's where you're going, those individuals or those groups have very specific demands. And so you have to have considered those demands in your process and ensure that they're being met all along the way if you're going to be successful. Risk management. How much risk comes with a diagnostic result or device performance? We've been talking about that a little bit throughout the presentation, but that becomes one of the biggest deals that can also impact your venture capitalists and your investors. Patient impact. How significant is this going to be to the patient? You know, I've seen some drugs that have made it to market because there was no other drug there. And when you look at the side effects, listen to some of the commercials on TV. If you really listen to those rapid fire side effects coming through, you wonder how in the world did that product actually come to market? It's because it was an impact on patients that had no other choice. And so that's what you have to look at is, particularly medical devices, if there's a risk, sometimes that's an acceptable risk if there's no other way to get there. User side human factors risk. Is there a possibility that the individuals, the human factors are playing into your product's utility and enhancing its risk, such that, yeah, we need this in a controlled environment with medical professionals monitoring its performance. That's not bad, but it does set up a different kind of environment and a different kind of control, set of controls that you need to put into the design. Liabilities for false results. The higher your number of false results is, the more significant your risk profile is, unless you have defined this as a screening mechanism. I'd much rather be given a false positive if I'm going to be screening for a potential disease state that's significant, that can then be confirmed with something else. I'm all for it. But if I'm getting a false result that then is a positive and it's going to take me somewhere without a confirmation, that's a liability. So that sensitivity and specificity on IVDs becomes really, really critical, and ensuring that you have a clear picture of the false results, whether they're positive or negative, for your product is well defined. Doesn't mean your product won't come to market, because there is a way to use it in some regards, but it does make it very important that you have documentation to support what those limitations are. Infringement on existing devices IP, we've talked about that. That becomes a serious situation. You may not hear anything from the person who has the intellectual property until you finish doing all the work. And then their lawyer sends you a letter informing you that they want all your documentation and the product you've created. It belongs to them. Now you've got a legal warfare going on. And if you're a researcher or a small business, you're out of luck. I once had a scientist come to me and say, we built this years ago. This device can do unbelievable things. You know, she talked to me about it, and she said, we've met with several big companies. We've even given them our prototype because we wanted them to take it to market, but they never called us back. That's where your IP is in trouble. I said, did you file your IP before you shared any of this and get them under non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality? No, we just really wanted to get this out there. Never happened, didn't have a business, wasn't able to do anything with it, but her technology and her information was shared with numerous competitors that I'm sure used that information. This was years ago. I felt so bad for her, but all I could say to her is, here's the things you have to consider. And the reimbursement and payer ID. Once you get that kind of stuff, now you're kind of golden, because that gives the opportunity for you to show what the value is to any business arrangement. So these are the key early stage questions. These two slides are probably the most critical piece I've given you today. If you use those, if you define those up front, they may change along the way slightly, but thinking about those kind of merges all of the pieces that design control comes into play for to get you to where you want to be. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about some example scenarios. And yes, they really did happen. We're getting really close to time, so I may not have time to go through all three, but I'll briefly talk to you about them. It's something for you to think about. Go to scenario number one. This was an in vitro diagnostic device. It was developed in a research lab, showed great performance. The product was produced and tested by the inventor, and it was showing unbelievable results for something that was really critical in emergency care. Every device took about 2 weeks to build in the lab. It's very intricate work, but it worked unbelievably. It was a diagnostic test system, and the elements, the components of the test kit had to be made in the lab. Because it was taking so long and because they wanted to get things moving, they took some of the lab developed tests to the clinical labs to make sure that the testing was showing performance, and it was. They needed multiple devices in a timely manner so that they could move this to what they called near design lock. They decided to get it there and move it on into a CMO. So they found a CMO that had been recommended to them. It was several states away. They took their near design lock while they were still working on it to get it where it needed to be with the inventor in the lab to the CMO. Contract Manufacturing Organization was signed up, committed to produce 50 plus devices with reproducible results. Here's what happened. The device never made it out of the GMP environment. They could not get reproducibility. And even those that could meet some of the specs, after they put them out into the test lab, they didn't work. Couldn't figure it out. Made multiple runs. The inventors accepted the devices finally. They flew in. They would take multiple trips in. They would talk with the CMO. They talked about specifications, manufacturing plans. They trained and retrained the staff. They did found additional funding to keep this thing going, to keep in this routine of why is this device not working. They finally decided to take the devices that the CMO had built because their contract was written such that it didn't have to work. It just had to be met to what they had been provided, which was a near design lock specification. And they took those devices, brought them back into the research lab out of the GMP environment, tried to manipulate them to get them to work. But even then, the results were inconsistent on the reworked devices. So what went wrong, and what do they do now? They're running out of money. They needed to continue the project and identify a new CMO, because this CMO, when they really dove into it, had no experience in working with in vitro diagnostics, in particular this particular kind. They thought they could figure it out and obviously couldn't. And they never really got to design lock in the inventor's lab. So a lot of problems with all of this in general. Didn't qualify the vendor, didn't make sure that they knew what they were doing, didn't have a contract that really specified what the deliverables were, and they found themselves in a muddy pit trying to get this product come back to where the lab, the research scientist, was able to make it work. Kind of a sad scenario, but the last I heard, they were trying to seek additional funding. Next slide. Scenario number 2, a de novo device for early detection of a critical disease state was showing promising results not seen in the commercial market. Later stage diagnostic products were out there, but they weren't able to detect what this device could do early on the disease states. And early disease detection is always important. Success was obvious with the team. They were well funded to take the device to the next stages of development, ultimate productization. They met their design lock. Everything was moving along, but they were reluctant to go to design lock. They wanted to keep making more development. They thought they could enhance it to do even more. They wanted to produce and publish additional findings. They were in a university environment. They knew that they'd set up their small business, but they really wanted to keep going with it in the environment it was in because it was being so successful. They were encouraged to engage with FDA and establish a regulatory pathway forward, but it was met with resistance. The inventor just didn't want to talk to FDA, didn't want to get out there yet. They had more they thought they could do. It was working. It met their specs. They were ready to go, but they wanted to do more, and they really were focused more on publication. The funding started to dwindle. The grad students supporting the effort graduated and moved on, and it didn't go anywhere. So what went wrong? They just couldn't turn it loose. They could not let it go, and their focus, although they had defined it as bringing the product to market and they'd set up a business, what their focus really was publishing data. And finally, the third scenario. I have that one there. Yeah, scenario 3. Grayson, you on scenario 3?
Yes, it's advanced.
Grayson, Oh, I thought I'd lost you guys.
Yeah.
A device for an unmet need was now in design lock. It had engaged with FDA a year earlier in the development stage and was confident the product was going to be a de novo submission. Make this one really quick. Work was underway, but the lack of funding had delayed progress. And so now they were 2 years behind what the FDA had agreed to and the timeline they had for the submission. They had no additional Q-Sub meetings with FDA or had not reviewed their regulatory business strategy. They just kept trying to ensure that they were getting adequate clinical data to make the submission. They attempted to build a structure for the new business, and they diverted a lot of their funds to hiring key personnel full-time while they were trying to get the funds to get the clinical data to build the product. So they kind of got off focus a little bit. When they finally saw that they were about ready to go, they identified a new device had been approved by FDA that was significantly equivalent to their device. And so now what are they going to do? They're going to have to back up and do either drop the de novo classification and probably change their whole strategy to go forward with the product and determine whether or not it's still going to meet their business expectations and their needs. So could have completely taken them off track because they just didn't monitor all of the aspects of what they needed to be doing. So next slide. So how do we get out of this? Boy, that was a nasty situation. How do we get to successful design lock? What are the things that really make a difference? Timing of tasks and actions and the end game are critical to get recognized success. Is it going to be a research product only? You can sell those, market them as research use only, and you have a different kind of market. Or you can sell the technology for a licensed use or outright purchase to one of the big guys out there that's building medical devices that wants your abilities. You can build a business. You can start to support first generation, get that out there, make some money, and then enhance and have later stage products for broader utility coming out of you. Selling too early can result in significant financial loss. Selling too late, and you're spending unnecessary dollars and may not make it to market. Business plan and regulatory strategy integration. The regulators, the investors, the market analysis, it changes. It's something you saw 2 years ago or something you looked at even 6 months ago may change a little bit. So keeping your pulse on, are the regulations changing? Are our investors happy? Is the market still where we thought it was? And what are the timeline alignments? How fast can we move forward to get this to making money and get it ultimately not just to making money, but in the hands of the patients, the physicians that need it to take care of the unmet need you're working on. And finally, managing the device risk throughout the life cycle of development. That is probably the most critical element, along with merging all of your activities and keeping a pulse on them routinely to your success. Next slide. So in summary, crossing the design lock abyss can be really easy, provided you have a clearly defined, disciplined approach that includes an integrated technical proposal, regulatory strategy, and commercialization potential, and a thoughtful business plan to reach your endpoint, whether you're selling your technology or building a business to support patient access to your innovation. So after this, I hope that was helpful to everyone. I'm sorry you couldn't see my face during all of this, but it's not worth seeing, so you're fine. You'll see that at the end of this presentation, I've given you numerous regulatory resources. There's, Grayson, if you'll go down 2 slides, CDRH is always a good place to start, to talk to get advice, to set up Q-Sub meetings and get into finding what you need to be successful. Next slide, references. I've given you all of the guidance documents that I thought might be useful to you. There's about 3 slides of those. And also, there was a really interesting blogger that has put out a medical device guide, if you will, and I've given you the website location for that. Go back to the end slide, if you would, please, Grayson. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm open for any questions. I know we only have a couple more minutes. I apologize for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane, for that great presentation. Um, yes, those resources that Diane mentioned will be shared along with the recording after the webinar. If you do have any questions, we have time for maybe one or two. Please do go ahead and drop those in the Q&A function. All right, we have one here from Christine. What are the key success factors for selecting an appropriate CRO?
That's a good question. It depends, and I know I hate to give that answer, but that's really the way it is. Your vendor qualification process is really a quality function that pulls management together, and you sit down and write out, if you will, a checklist. And there are ones out there that I can provide you, or others can provide you. There are forms of here's what we need for this person, this organization. But the consistent elements tend to be: is it a sound company? Has it got a good reputation? Has it been inspected by the Food and Drug Administration? If so, what were the results? Has their work been successful in the past? And do they have experience doing what we need them to do? If you've confirmed all of that with them, and then you go in and you look at their environment, if you're asking for GLP testing or if you're asking for GMP testing, do they have the adequate requirements to meet those environmental controls and those documentation requirements? Do they have a good quality system? These are the kinds of questions that you want answered. You can do it by sending them a form and saying, please respond with these information, or you can go on site, or you can set up a teleconference with them. But you want your quality person involved with that. They're the best people to help you determine whether a CRO or a CMO is going to meet your needs. And doing that, what is known in the regulations as a vendor qualification, is your responsibility as a manufacturer to have that conducted and proven before you get started. That's where you find your weaknesses, and that's where you find out whether or not they're going to likely succeed when you ask them to do something for you.
Great. Thanks so much, Diane. And with that, we are just about at time. So I want to thank everyone so much for attending today's webinar. As a reminder, please do fill out that poll. We really appreciate your feedback. Like Marissa mentioned in the chat, we will send the recording of the webinar along with the resources Diane shared in the slides out to everyone later on. So thanks again and have a wonderful weekend.